So, when you think about Georgia's history, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Probably the year 1733, right? But what if I told you that the real story of this land, the story of its first great cities, actually started thousands of years before that? Today, we're going to uncover this incredible civilization that shaped the entire region long before any Europeans ever showed up.
So who were these original city builders? Who had the vision, the know-how, and the organization to create these complex societies and sprawling towns right here in Georgia over 1,000 years ago? Well, that's the big mystery we're going to unravel today. Well, the answer is a group called the Mississippian people. When Spanish explorers first showed up in the mid-1500s, this was the culture they met. And we're not talking about just a few scattered tribes, no. They were a dominant, super-organized civilization that had totally mastered this land.
And listen, these were not simple little villages. We're talking about large, planned towns built right near rivers and home to thousands of families. Just picture it, a bustling community with a big central plaza, different neighborhoods, and the whole thing was protected by some pretty serious defensive structures. I mean, moats, guard towers, the whole 9 yards. These were cities built to last.
And right at the heart of these towns were these massive earthen mounds. Now, these weren't just random piles of dirt. They were huge structures, built by hand to be the absolute epicenter of their world. They were used for religious ceremonies, big social get-togethers, and sometimes even as sacred burial grounds. They were the focal point for the entire community.
Now, building cities on this kind of scale, well, that takes more than just good engineering, right? It takes a complex, really organized society. So, what did that society actually look like? How were they structured to pull off these incredible feats?
The Mississippians organized themselves into what archaeologists call a chiefdom. And really, all that means is a society with a really clear chain of command. Not just a single leader, but a very structured, hierarchical system with clear levels of power and responsibility.
So, if you break it down, their society basically had two main groups. At the very top, you had the elites. This was a small, powerful group who called the shots. And then you had the commoners, who were the vast majority of the population. They were the workforce, the people building the mounds, farming the fields, and pretty much keeping the whole chiefdom running.
So where did all these thousands of commoners live? Well, they built their homes using this really ingenious method called wattle and daub. Basically, they would weave a frame from sticks, that's the wattle, and then they'd pack it with the mix of mud and clay, which is the daub. These were one-room shelters, mostly just for sleeping, since most of their lives were spent outside, working and socializing with the community.
And get this, these towns weren't just isolated little islands. Nope. They were all connected by this huge, sophisticated trade network. You got to imagine things like shimmering shell beads, beautifully designed pottery, and sharp stone tools traveling all across the region, connecting all these different communities and cultures. They were a deeply interconnected people.
Okay, so you've got thousands of people living in these bustling cities. You gotta feed them, right? And the Mississippians weren't just great builders. They were true masters of the land. They had this deep understanding of agriculture and their natural environment.
And man, their diet was incredibly rich and diverse. On one hand, they farmed staple crops like corn, squash, and beans. But they also supplemented all of that by hunting deer, turkey, and fish, and by gathering wild nuts, berries, and plums. You see, this wasn't just about surviving, it was about thriving, and that required a really intimate knowledge of their environment.
But the real game changer for them, the absolute foundation of their agriculture, was maize. You know, corn. This was the crop that fueled their entire civilization. As their populations grew, they went from just small-scale gardening to massive, organized farms. And it was maize that made it all possible for their huge chiefdoms to flourish.
And they were so smart about how they farmed. They didn't just plant big fields of one single crop like we often see today. Instead, they used this system of intermixing plants. They'd plant these tall corn stalks, which would then provide a natural sun shield for squash and beans planted in the shaded ground right below. It's a brilliant example of sustainable agriculture that shows a deep, practical understanding of how plants work together.
Of course, if you're gonna farm and hunt effectively, you need good tools. The Mississippians perfected the bow and arrow, for sure, but one of their most important materials was something called chert. It's a type of sedimentary rock that they could skillfully shape into unbelievably sharp knives and other tools, which were essential for pretty much everything, from farming and hunting to daily life, and even fighting.
I mean, think about it. This culture dominated Georgia for nearly 800 years.
That's a remarkably long time. But like all great civilizations, their era eventually came to an end. And when the change came, it was incredibly fast and decisive.
The turning point, the moment that would alter the course of their history forever, was the arrival of Spanish explorers led by Hernando de Soto right in the mid-1500s. This first contact marked the beginning of a catastrophic and irreversible change for the Mississippian people.
So let's just trace this dramatic shift for a second. Around 800 CE, the Mississippian culture really hits its stride. For centuries, they built, farmed, and traded all across the region. Then, in the mid-1500s, the Spanish arrive. The diseases they brought with them, things the Mississippians had absolutely no immunity to, were just devastating. Within a few short decades, by about 1600 CE, their entire complex society had collapsed. And the survivors? Well, they were forced to start all over again.
But this is so important to understand. While the great Mississippian chiefdoms were gone, the people themselves did not just disappear. The survivors of this catastrophe, they reorganized. They formed the historic tribes that we know today as the Creek and the Cherokee. Their culture was transformed, but their lineage, their story, it continued.
So that leaves us with this final thought. Knowing that Georgia's history doesn't start in 1733, but stretches back thousands of years to a time of great cities and complex societies like the Mississippians, how does that change the way we see this place? How does it change the stories we tell about it? It's a powerful reminder of the deep, layered history that's literally just beneath our feet. Thanks for joining me on this journey back in time.